Alright, it's not very often that I actually will be a total fanboy of whomever I'm interviewing, and this interview probably will seem like an unlikely candidate, but Olivier Gillet is just an amazing character in terms of both his approach to how he does what he does and the result therein. I got to know about his work some time ago when I was a dedicated but still kind of wet behind the ears Baji Loops user, and subsequent to that I have now become a user of his modules. I think he's an amazing system designer, and he seems to really have his finger on not only how to make things but how to learn to make things. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. It was a real joy for me, and I'm sorry for being a fanboy, but there you go. Okay, this week we are going to have a really special guest. His name is Olivier Gillet, and he is the man behind the Mutable instruments systems. Now, if you're not familiar with them, you should be. They're amazing. I have one of his Eurorack modulars in my small performing system. It's called the Braids, and it represents so many unique methods of synthesis that I couldn't not own it. He also, in addition to making Eurorack modules, he also is involved in developing and offering standalone hardware devices. There are synthesizers, there's a MIDI processor that's available, but he also has a really interesting background in doing some software development. So let's say hi to Olivier. Hi.
Hi.
That's always an awkward transition, but I hope that you don't mind me gushing over you a little bit. I find your work fascinating and inspiring every time I use it. Let's start off our conversation by having you give us a little bit of your background. Tell us how you got to where you are.
Okay. So one thing I can say that, as far as I can remember, the first time I learned to program computer, so it was in the 1990s, and the first thing I remember is that so we started programming in BASIC. So you do this first program like input what is your name, and then print your name. And so we had these classes at school when we learned basic programming. And the first question I asked the teacher was, can we program it to make music?
Of course.
And so if you remember basic programming, so at the time you had this statement in the programming language called play, and you had to type a string with the notes. So you type C, C, E, F, and it played a melody with this shitty beep sound. And so I was really fascinated by that, and I started thinking, okay, can we make it play random strings, or can you make strings that are interesting melodies? Or so really, I think the thing that got me interested in programming and later mathematics was music.
Sure. What was this first computer system that you were using?
I think at school we had Amstrad PCs, or maybe it was the CPC or something, but I did not have a computer at home. And in fact, it took me 4 or 5 years during which I was interested in programming, but did not have a computer at home. So I was using the computers at school, or staying staying at some friends' houses just to play with the computer. And I was writing the program on just a paper at home and then trying it at school. So I did not have my own computer.
Oh, that's incredible. Would you say then that like you were hooked by programming immediately?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The place where I inadvertently first met you, I didn't know you at the time, was through a program that you wrote for Palm operating systems for small handheld devices. You had two programs. Well, first of all, I don't even know how to say the name of the company. It was like Chocopoolp.
Yeah, Chocopoolp.
Chocopoolp. Right. Well, good. But there were two programs that you had written for that. One called Microbe, and
Yeah.
one called Baji's Loop. That were incredibly important to me. At that time, I was traveling a lot. I spent a lot of time in airports and on airplanes. And there's probably no less creative place in the world than an airplane. And so I found myself sitting on the airplane wondering, how can I turn this time into creative time? And uh, I did some searching around and talking to some people, and they were all like, you got to take a look at this Baji's loops and these micro programs. You might find them interesting. And so I looked at them and I saw that they required a Palm OS device, and I actually went out and bought a Palm specifically to run these two programs. And I had a blast. It was amazing, but it was also completely unlike anything else in the world. I mean, it was so much more advanced than anything I had seen on, certainly on handheld devices at that time. And in a way, there's some of this is like more advanced than most of what you even still find on an iPhone. How did you wedge that much music making into a small device like a Palm system?
I got interested in these devices because I got an internship in a company developing software development tools for Palms. So my project there was a compiler for Palm.
Okay.
So the boss of this company told me, okay, if you want to develop any application in your spare time, you can do it, or you can even do it on company time. Try to make it as advanced as possible, and it will be a kind of test to exercise the compiler.
Uh-huh.
And I think this development tool we were working on was quite good, and it allowed me to really push the limit of what I was making on this system.
Oh, that's really interesting, because you see a lot of programs that are people's labors of love, but they often don't have this kind of complexity. For those of you listening, it was Chocopoolp, and that's Chocopoolp, which the website for that still exists. In fact, it looks like you are giving away free copies of this to anyone who can still find a Palm 5 device, huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting because the complexity is there, but also it reveals some of your clear interests. So, like, Microbe very much had an orientation towards kind of an analog feeling type device, and certainly the synthesizer tool inside of Baji's Loop allowed you to explore some ideas with sort of like virtual analog type devices. So I thought that was really interesting because at that time, I guess I would say, especially on these small mobile devices, people were all about samples. And your system not only did samples, but it did the synthesis, it did sequencing. I mean, it was pretty much a full-fledged DAW, really. What experience had you had with sort of like analog systems and analog synthesizers prior to working on this software?
I started making electronic music since I was, what, teenager, yeah, 15, 16.
Okay.
So progressively, I bought a couple of analog synths. I got an SH 101. Then I got an Ensoniq ESQ1, which is not purely analog, but another hybrid synth. And then I bought a sampler. I bought some early drum machines. So I got some experience with music gear.
Sure. Now, at what point did you make the transition from doing the work on the Palm system to the development of the Mutable Instruments devices?
So there was a big black hole between 2007 and 2009. So in fact, the Palm platform just died.
Yeah, it disappeared, right?
2007, it was already dead. Then the iPhone came, and I thought for a while, okay, maybe it's time to make a move to the iPhone platform. And at the beginning, it was still a closed system because the API to develop apps, it was not open. At the beginning, the first release of the iPhone, you could only do web apps.
Right.
Then the app development SDK was released, I don't know, around the end of 2007 or beginning 2008. But somehow it did not feel right. I think that I was not interested in this platform the same way I got excited about the Palm. Maybe it was because it was closed, or I don't know. And I was looking for a better platform to continue developing something. And then I remember something. So when I did this internship on the Palm software development stuff, one of my teachers asked me, so are you going to continue your studies and work on compiler or embedded systems? And I told him, no, I'm not sure. I will probably focus on signal processing. But then I remember that that this teacher thought that I would be good at embedded system. Mm-hmm. And I start wondering that, okay, maybe what I'm looking for is not a smartphone or a computer platform. Maybe what I'm looking for is one level down. Maybe what I'm looking for is hardware platform electronics.
Mm-hmm.
So I started thinking, okay, maybe you have to learn electronics. And I was not sure how to start because I had absolutely no prior experience with electronic. And then in summer 2009, I saw online an article about a hack using an Arduino.
Okay.
This is a point at which I thought, okay, maybe this is what I should try to learn.
Okay, yeah.
So I bought an Arduino board, and immediately I was instantly hooked. Just like when I started programming, it was this kind of, wow, this is what I had been looking for.
Interesting.
So just in a couple of days, I started created simple MIDI devices. The first thing I did was MIDI to CiviGate interface. And then I started creating simple sound generators and basic digital synthesizer. And this project ultimately became the Shorty.
Right. In these early experiments, were you actually using the Arduino for sound generation, or did you have it controlling other circuitry?
Just for sound generation.
My goodness. Having done some work with the Arduino, I am aware that getting that to run well enough to make sound is actually quite an accomplishment. Now, when you first developed these products, they were sold as kits, right?
Yeah.
And how did you like doing kit sales? I mean, you got excited by the Arduino. Did you find that the community for that sort of kit building synthesizer environment, that was growing also, or was it already pretty big?
I think I was quite isolated at the time I did this because when I announced that I had built my first hardware synth, it was still on the Badges Loops forum.
Oh, okay.
So when I started this project, I did not even look at what kind of projects other people were doing. Or I think, for example, if you look at the synth DIY community, you see that most people are building modules.
Right.
I did not want to look at that because I thought that it would push me in one direction or another. So I just closed my eye on everything other people were doing and just did my stuff in my corner and published it on the Badges Loops forum. And there were a couple of people interested in it. So I decided, okay, I will make kits. How many people want? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I will make 10 kits. And that's it. I did not I did not want it to become a business or whatever. It was just, it seemed that some people might enjoy building it. So, okay, I will sell kits.
Well, but it obviously became a business because you followed that initial kit up with your first scaled up item. Was that the Shruthi? I have to get the pronunciation of it. That's Shruthi?
Yeah.
The Shruthi one. So that's like the first big project, and I think that's still available, right?
Okay, so there was a transition at one point. So when I started the Shruti, I wanted it to have an analog filter.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a dead Ensoniq ESQ1. So I decided to use some of the chips from this synth. And since it was a 8-voice synth, I got 8 chips, so it was almost enough for my first batch of kits.
I see.
And then 10 people, 20 people, 30 people came and wanted one too. So I tried to find small stocks of the filter chips from the ESQ1, and then I had to give up because it's quite difficult to find parts.
Sure.
There was this very small initial run, and then I had to stop because of this part. And I redesigned the entire project from scratch. This time, taking into account the fact that I should be able to sell 100 or 200 of them if there is demand. So I restricted myself to only easy to find parts.
Okay, sure. That makes sense. So you had hoped to sell 100 or 200, but I don't know, I'm thinking that you sold more than that.
Yes.
Because I see them around a lot, and I also see that you're still selling them, so that's pretty impressive. Now, I have to ask, because I am fascinated by this, so you didn't have any formal training in electronics, you just learned this by yourself?
Yeah, but so I had training in signal processing and statistics, so it was sort of easy to learn.
I see. So because you had the DSP background, then that kind of points to the idea that you're using these microprocessors as the sound generation tool. That makes a lot of sense, and it also helps me understand how you're getting such good performance out of relatively low-powered processors. When is it that you transitioned from doing standalone instruments to deciding you were going to start doing modules?
Yeah, at the beginning of 2012, I wanted to purchase a bit of test equipment to design analog circuits. So I needed function generators, amplifiers, and so on.
Sure.
And I looked at the market at what you could buy as regular test equipment, and it was quite expensive, and it was not really targeted to audio application. And then I considered buying some modular stuff, not to use it to make music, but just to have like a good sine wave generator, good sawtooth wave generator, and so on. And yeah, it was a good idea. So I bought a small Doppler rack with VCO, an LFO, and just a bare minimum. And once I switched it on, I started patching it, and oh my god, I love it. So I think I used it as test equipment, maybe just twice, and I really got hooked up to the patching and sound creation. I really loved it. So immediately, okay, I want to make modules now.
Right. That's hilarious. I have to admit that, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, because in fact it seems like so much test equipment now is really made to work on like cell phones or something. And so but thinking of a case of Depher material as or Depher modules as being a test equipment and then falling in love with it as an instrument, that is a wonderful story. Was the braids your first module?
Yes.
I'll tell you a little story. When I first saw a demo of it, first of all, whatever I was holding, I dropped, because I thought I was fascinated by it. As you probably can guess from my email address, I do a lot of things in sort of like software DSP design. And I had always felt like, you know, a lot of that activity, I was shut out of that on the with my modular system. I have a small modular system, and I was shut out of doing some of those processes because they just either weren't available or would have taken so many modules that it wasn't practical for wanting to keep my system small. Then I saw a demo of the braids, and I was blown away, because not only did it do a lot of different processes. You have physical modeling in there, you have sort of the VOSIM process, you have a really cool FM implementation, you have multi-oscillator implementations. It's just a playground of sound generating stuff. But the other thing I really noticed was how musical it was. In designing this, how do you put together a module and say, I'm going to make a module and it's going to have like 15 different sound generating processes in it? I mean, first of all, how did you know that the system could support that much? And secondly, what is it in your background that makes you comfortable with working with all these different kinds of sound generating models?
Okay, so if you look at the oscillator section in the Shruti, you already see that it tries to cover as much ground as possible in terms of synthesis technique. But of course, when I work on the Shruti oscillator, there are many technical limitations. Like you have a budget of 400 CPU cycle per sample, and then you have to divide it by 2 because you have 2 oscillators running on the Shruti. So when I started working on braids, I decided to use a small ARM CPU. Mm-hmm. It's almost like 10 times more powerful than the Arduino. And then, since it will be running only one voice of synthesis, one oscillator, suddenly I got 20 times as much processing power as what I had been working on for the past 3 years.
Right.
Suddenly, it's like everything is possible. So.
Well, now you've been active in continuing to change what the braids does too. I know that since I got my system, there's been some upgrades that have included, first it included some built-in envelopes, and then some new routing options were made available, which is really interesting. And the question is, where do you see the point being reached where now there's not enough user interface controls to really support the many things you're doing? Because already isn't it a little hard to sort of imagine working with built-in envelopes when they don't have their own controls?
So I think at the beginning, the built-in envelope was just that it was required by the physical synthesis models, because when you do physical simulation, you simulate an excitation propagating through a medium. So there had to be this initial excitation. So
sure.
This is why I put this envelope, and then since it's available in this mode, I thought about extending it to the other modes, so we could have some consistency between all this model. And then, well, people ask me, okay, can you turn it into a VCA? Can you turn it into a modulation envelope? So it's only code, so it's possible.
Right.
I agree that in terms of user interface, it's not really pretty to have all this extra option hidden in menus. But the thing is that so when I implement this feature, for example, also the quantizer, I say to myself, okay, it's just 10 lines of code or 20 lines of code. That's it. If you want to pretend it's not there in the module, and if you don't want to look at the menu, just don't bother.
Yeah, and in fact, that's maybe the beauty of the braids, is that there's a lot more complexity there that you can choose to use, but you don't have to.
Yeah, exactly.
And about even the only way that you know that there's an envelope involved at all is because of the trigger input. And it makes perfect sense the first time you use like the plucked model and you trigger it, you're like, oh, of course, it has to have that. That's what makes it not be a sample, right?
Mm.
But otherwise, I think it's just brilliantly designed, and the implementation is nice. It's also a beautiful looking module. It's one of the few modules that has what I would say it has like an artistic faceplate. I mean, it has like, is that an imprint, or is that, I think that's just a printing, right? Of sort of like the paisley shape on there.
Yes.
But just like all of, even your logo, you have like little edging on the tops and the bottoms. Your choice of muted but nice colors makes it so that there seems to be as much of, you're as concerned about the tastefulness of the expression of the instrument as you are about how it sounds. And I noticed this about your standalone units as well. You have plexiglass cases, but it's not just a square box where it sits in. It'll have interesting cutouts. It'll have interesting printing on it. What about that part of instrument building? What about that is important to you? Why do you think it's important to have sort of like beauty in the device itself?
When it comes to the modules, I looked at what the other manufacturers and designers did, and I thought that there wasn't much variety in terms of the theme or the universe of in the modular. It was either really test equipment like,
Right.
Or maybe one can find influences from science fiction, like modules with planet names,
Or
or
lightning bolts. Yeah. Right.
yeah, or, a very fancy device from a scientific experiment. What the name of this module? Yeah, the morphing terrarium, or
Oh, right.
something
Yes.
like that. I like it. I understood it, but I wanted to do something different. So I started doing some sketches, and also I started collecting some documentation, pictures of things I liked and did not like. But I'm not a good graphic designer. I'm interested in graphics and design, but I don't think I'm good enough. So I gave all this stuff, all the pictures, all the photos, samples of Indian textiles, really everything I wanted to have in one way or another in the design of the modules to a graphic designer. So his name is Hannes Pasqualini.
Okay.
So far, during 2 3 months, he worked on the design language for the module, and we battled a lot about fonts, colors, everything, and I'm really happy with the result.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I, like you, tend to think of modules as being very much like lab equipment. At first, when I bought the braids, I was like, well, I don't care what graphics it has. I'll just bring it in. But when it's sitting in my system, because it has kind of like this depth of look and stuff, it actually inspires me to use it more, which is kind of a funny thing because with modular systems, you tend to think, well, I'm going to connect this process with another process. You don't tend to think of sort of like the visual nature of it being inspiring, but I find the style of the Mutable instrument stuff to be very inspirational to me. Now, you since the braids, you've come out with a number of different modules. The edges, which I've not used, nor have I used the grids. I have used the ripples, which I think is a pretty phenomenal little module. Are all of these DSP based, or are some of them pure analog?
No, the filter ripples is purely analog.
Oh, okay. I'm still amazed that all of your circuit building knowledge is, you self learn that stuff. I have to ask a question because I'm curious about this. Where did you go to learn about electronics, to learn about music electronics, particularly?
Um, I found one absolutely excellent set of class material online. It's from, okay, let me, his name is Aaron Lanterman, and he's a professor at Georgia Institute of Technology.
Okay.
And I think the only guy in the US teaching university class about analog synthesizers.
Okay.
So you can find on his website class materials and problems and even videos of the classes. And so really is teaching how to make a VCO, how to make a VCF, and so on. I really like this stuff because it's made for students in electrical engineering. So there's not a lot of hand waving. It's really writing down the equations for everything, and it was something I could process.
Sure. Well, it seems like your background in DSP probably set you up to deal with that pretty well, also. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the things that I think is pretty. Oh, well, before I talk about that, I want to talk about one more thing with modules. So right now, currently available is the braids, the edges, the ripples, and the grids.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some new ones. I know there's one called Frames that's coming out, which is like that's like an animation sequencer for CV, right?
Yeah.
And then it's Peaks, I think, which is sort of like an envelope. What is there any others that I'm forgetting?
So there is a module called Tides, which is attack decay or attack release envelope generator. It's also an LFO and also digital oscillator.
Got it. Right.
It might sound a bit strange to have all these different features in one module because usually people break down modules into function like this is going to be an oscillator, this is going to be an LFO, and this is going to be an envelope. And for Tides, the process was a bit different. So I said, okay, I will make a module with things that go up and down.
Okay, sure.
So I explored all the different way in which we can make a waveform go up and down. So it can have a different ratio for the up and down time. It can have a different curve for the up and down section, and also you can add little wiggles on the waveform. And so if it does a single cycle, it's going to be an envelope. If it does if it's endlessly repeating, it's going to be an LFO, and depending on its frequency, it's going to be a CV, LFO, or an oscillator. Sure. So it's really this basic concept of something going up and down, but with all the variation of this concept, you have a module that can do different functions. And then there is also a MIDI interface called yarns.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's pretty impressive. When is this new set of modules going to be available for retailers?
So I got the factory on the phone this morning, and they are finishing the testing of frames, yarns, and tides. So I'm going to get them next week.
Oh, great! I'm looking forward to that. One of the things that I find that's really interesting about both your instruments and your modules is that you have pretty completely embraced the open source community, such that your stuff is you publish the hardware circuits, you publish the software, and you, in fact, even in your projects area, you go so far as to offer some of the libraries that you use to do the work. What is it about the open source community that has you embracing them that significantly? Because a lot of other modules out there that do have a digital basis, and certainly all of the hardware modules, very few of them have this open source mentality. What about it? What about open source compelled you to do that?
So there are two things. The first one is that for many years, I worked for companies who were really secretive about what they were doing. And I did not like the fact that everything I was working on was kind of hidden behind NDAs or patents or things like that. And when I started developing this synthesizer, it was the first project I was really doing for myself. I said, okay, well, this time you are on your own. So if you want to share it, please do it, because you won't have the opportunity at another point in your life. So.
Right. Well, that's interesting, and that's actually really amazing, because I think a lot of the things that you're putting out there for the next generation of people like you, they're going to be able to look at that at that code or look at that hardware and use that to learn how to do their work and do the next generation of hardware and software and modules and great stuff.
The second reason is that many times I got very frustrated with the gear I was using. For example, I remember that on the MIDI reverb unit from Alesis. Yeah. For example, there were some parameters which were constrained in a given range. The delay could not go below such millisecond, or the feedback could not go beyond such percentage. And I really wanted to change it, and I was really frustrated that there were some limitation in the hardware, probably for some good reason, maybe because it did not perform well or it did not sound good if the parameter range were extended. But still, I wanted to be able to make this change. Since at the time I was already programming music software, I knew that it was really just a small change. It was just a constant somewhere in the code, or just one line of code to turn the instrument into something I really wanted to play with. And I did not want people who bought my instruments to feel the same frustration about them.
Sure.
So almost every day by email or on the forum, some people ask me, I love your synthesizer, but it would be even better if it had this small option, or if such setting was available, or if the UI worked in a slightly different way. And because the code is open source, it's possible to do this kind of customization.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and certainly I know what you mean about the frustration you would feel with closed systems, because often, someone like Alesis was making a reverb that would sound good on pop music, and those of us doing electronic music sometimes wanted things that would sound ugly in pop music, right? Mm-hmm. But for us, it would sound good. And not having the ability to experiment like that was quite frustrating, yes. Well, Olivier, I appreciate so much your time. I feel like I've sort of like used up your time, and you're a busy guy. I want you to get back in there and make those modules up so I can buy some more. But thank you very much for your time. One last question. What do you think is in the future for you and Mutable Instruments? What do you see coming in the future?
So I have this huge list of module ideas, and I want to continue, implementing everything on this list. Since the beginning of the year, I have started work on 4 concepts of modules, and I think I will do 3 more before the end of the year. So there will be 7 new modules finished at the end of the year.
Wow.
Probably 4 or 5 more for the next year. So one thing I haven't done so far is standalone, a complete standalone synth. Of course, you have the Shruti, but it's a DIY kit. So I'll probably at one point or another get back to doing a standalone synth.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you taking your time out of the schedule to talk to me. And have a great day.
Okay.
Right. Bye. And there you have it. Everything from what's next on the plate for Mutable Instruments to where Bajis came from in the first place. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did in terms of just learning about where all this stuff came from. I want to thank again everybody for their support of the podcast. As always, if you have any ideas, feel free to drop me a line. and especially if you have ideas for video artists. I want to do a little bit of work with some video artists in the near future. So if you have some ideas for video artists that you'd like to hear about, please drop me a line. The address, as always, is ddg@cycling74.com. I look forward to hearing from you, regardless of what you have to say. Otherwise, have a great week, and I'll talk to you next time.